That varies greatly depending on various factors, just as it does with regular vehicles. For example, over the years there have been full-size vans that seat as many as 15 people and as few as 6 or 7, and there have been minivans that seat as few as 6 and as many as 8. The range of seating capacity in wheelchair vans is even less consistent because depending on if it's side entry or rear, and if it's a full-size or minivan, those factors cause the seating to range from only a couple of passengers to many. As with most subjects related to wheelchair vans, what seems to be most helpful to most people is to address what the norms are, what is by far the most usual and common. And so I'll do that, and I'll also mention a couple of features that can benefit the seating capacity which most folks aren't aware of. To start, I'll briefly mention some van statistics to create a framework about the seating subject. As for full-size personal use wheelchair vans, about 95% of them in the past 20 years or so are what I would call standard length, which is a similar dimension no matter if the van is a Dodge, Ford, or Chevy. There are long versions of each of those brands, but rarely have they had a personal use history. Almost every long body wheelchair van has had a commercial or business use of some sort. And for various reasons, I strongly suggest that you avoid those. The main reason being because they tend to have had multiples more load and unload cycles and far more trips in a given amount of miles than personal use wheelchair vans. More cycles and shorter trips cause more wear and tear, and on vans more than a few years old, this wear and tear can lead to many problems and expense. And so, if you're going to buy a full-size wheelchair van, it's almost always going to be a standard length body. The very common seating capacity of these vans, if they have a side lift, is 3 seats with belts in the rear, and then the front passenger and driver. And usually the middle area of the van is open and vacant and is where the wheelchair gets parked. And so 5 people plus 1 in the wheelchair is what about 90% of the full-size wheelchair vans have when they have side entry. As for the rear lift full-size wheelchair vans, which make up only about 10% of personal use wheelchair vans, they vary more than the side lift vans as far as the seating goes. Of course, in order to load with a rear lift, the rear seat has to have been removed. And some of the rear lift vans have also had the middle seat removed, which leaves only the front 2 seats and a very large space for a wheelchair in the middle and rear of the van. Some of the rear lift vans still have the middle seat in them, which usually holds 3 people. However, that means that the person in a wheelchair is parked in the far rear, which is not what most people want. And so this is one of the major reasons why most personal use vans have a side lift, because the seating and parking of the wheelchair tends to work out much better for everyone. Sometimes there is one single person seat in the middle of the van, which allows the wheelchair to be parked in the middle next to that seat, but that arrangement only creates 3 total seats plus the person in the wheelchair. And so, without going into all of the uncommon variations and unusual configurations, you now understand that side lift vans generally are your best choice if seating for several passengers is important to you. And I'll note that for very large people and their large wheelchairs, rear lift vans are very beneficial because the rear lifts usually have a higher weight capacity and bigger platforms than side entry lifts, and also because there tends to be more space and easier maneuvering when loading in and out of the rear of a van. And so rear lift vans usually sacrifice seating, leading to better circumstances for certain people in wheelchairs. There are 2 features that can change these seating norms very much, which are what I call jump seats and flip and fold seats. The jump seats are an accessory seat that takes up only about half or 2/3 of the space or footprint that a typical single-person seat takes. These can be mounted nearly anywhere in a full-size van because they are modular and often have built-in seat belts. And so if you add 1 or 2 of these, you can gain extra seating without using nearly as much interior space as a single seat normally occupies. The other way to get extra seating is with what I call flip and fold seats. Very simply described, these are seats that are mounted along the outside edges of the floor, and when not being used, they fold upright and only intrude about 8 to 12 inches from the sidewall. And when you need to use this extra seating, in a few seconds these fold down and create 1 or 2 extra seats. These normally have integrated seat belts, and so they can be installed almost anywhere. And so now you know that depending on rear or side lift, seating capacity for personal use full-size wheelchair vans varies greatly, ranging from 2 people plus a wheelchair up to 5 people plus the wheelchair. And if a van has jump seats or flip and fold seats added, it can accommodate a couple of extra people, especially if they're kids or small adults who don't need a full-size seat. Okay, so I've spent time covering the subject of seating for full-size wheelchair vans. And so now I'll make some comments about minivan wheelchair van seating. This is a more uniform topic. First, when I talk about minivan wheelchair vans, I'm usually referring to lowered floor minivans with a ramp out the side, because that is what about 85% of minivan wheelchair vans are. In these vans, the seating configuration is usually the same from one van to the next. The way these are designed is that the middle seat is removed during the conversion process, and what remains is the rear seat that holds 3 people, and there are the front 2 seats with quick release mechanisms. The person in the wheelchair can park in the middle of the van or in either front seat location if they use the quick release mechanism to take one of those seats out of the van. This is a nice and versatile feature on this type of van. Very rarely there are lowered floor minivans that also have 2 quick release seats in the middle of the van. However, usually those must be removed when carrying a wheelchair. Occasionally, depending on the size of passengers and wheelchair, one of those can remain. And so the summary is this: depending on where the wheelchair parks, there's accommodation for 4 or 5 other passengers. Those are the numbers unless the van has the rare feature of removable middle row seats. There's another style of lowered floor wheelchair van that represents about 10% of minivan wheelchair vans. These have rear entry and a lowered floor. With this configuration, because the rear seat is always removed when the floor gets lowered, these vans are usually limited to seating for the person in the wheelchair or scooter and a total of 2 or 3 other people in the front and middle of the van. The exact number of seats depends on the brand of conversion and the way it was configured when it was built. If seating capacity is a big focus for you, these rear entry vans are probably not going to be your choice. The last type of minivan wheelchair van are ones that don't have a lowered floor and ramp. Instead, they have a side entry and a tall roof. These have the same seating capacity and configuration as the lowered floor side entry minivans, which is that they usually have seating for 3 in the rear, 2 in the front, and the middle of the van is where the wheelchair parks. However, these vans don't have the quick release front seats, and so there's no ability to park a wheelchair in the front. I've explained the seating variables of wheelchair vans as best I can in a few minutes. I hope this helps you to understand the norms and some possibilities.